say thanks, first of all, to Deborah Schneider for organizing our refreshments this morning, and to Hank and Penny Beecham for helping provide those today. And I'd like to begin with a prayer, if I could. Let us pray. Eternal and gracious God, we give you thanks that you have made yourself known to us by the speaking of your word and by the sending of your word in the flesh of Jesus Christ. That you have made yourself known to us in a way that we can begin to know you, begin to comprehend you and your will for our lives. Even so much that we can speak your word to each other in a language that we can understand. We thank you for this indescribable gift and for the beginnings of language to describe it in ways that preserve the mystery and beckon us into it even further. As we consider your word today and the ways that we speak it to one another, we pray that you would be with us in our understanding and with Brian Bibb and his teaching, that we would bring glory to you, that we would come to know you more fully and walk in your ways more nearly. May your Holy Spirit attend all that is said and heard today through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So this year's Pellett-Wearn lecture series is entitled A Theology of Bible Translation, and we are delighted to have Dr. Brian Bibb with us, a professor of religion at Furman University. If you haven't had a chance to read the insert in the bulletin that's been there the last couple of weeks about Dr. Bibb, I'll hit some highlights, but he is a Furman graduate and went from Furman to Princeton Seminary to be where he earned his Master's of Divinity and his Ph.D. in Biblical Studies with a specialty in Hebrew Bible and Old Testament. And then returned to Furman in 2000 to teach religion there, which means he's now in his 18th year of teaching at Furman. He's been doing a lot of work in the translation of the Bible, the theology of translation, and is working on a book entitled A Journey Through Languages, How Understanding the Translation Process Can Guide Our Reading of the Old Testament, which is soon to be published, or going to be published by Smith & Helwas. Brian is married to Jennifer, who is also a graduate of Furman. They have two sons, Joseph, age 13, and Nolan, age 10. Brian is an elder in the PCUSA and is a member at First Presbyterian Church of Greer. So we appreciate Brandy Casto-Waters and the congregation in Greer, and I should say Steve Vance and others at Greer loaning Brian to us for these 6 weeks. He teaches in his church an adult Sunday school class entitled Religion 101, and he advertises it as a Furman religion class without the tests and papers. So we don't know if there are any tests and papers at the end of this series, but either way, we look forward to all that Brian will bring to us today, and we welcome you to the podium.
Am I on? All right. It's working? Great. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank you so much for the invitation. This is an area that I've been working on for a while. I am very grateful for the opportunity to share my thinking and writing with you over the next few weeks. I began thinking about translation as an academic area of research through my teaching. Since students at Furman generally do not have any Hebrew or Greek facility, I use an electronic Bible translation application to display multiple versions at once, which lets me point to spots where translations differ. These textual bits are usually the most interesting places to begin our conversation about interpretation. You can sort of see that. Okay. So, as students observe these translation differences, they naturally ask questions like, why are there differences? How should we evaluate them? Is one translation right while other ones are wrong? Are there certain kinds of differences that have different explanations? Are these differences significant? Can we even trust the Bibles that we have? What is the best translation? That's by far the most common question that I get. These are the questions that I began researching out of my teaching and that we will be covering in our sessions the next few weeks. I want to begin by considering where the Bible came from. Usually people say, how did we get our Bible? Make sure it's not me. Okay. Well, the question, how did we get our Bible, I think has three separate components. First, we need to look at how the ancient authors of the Bible handled and created and managed texts. I'm going to use the phrase, which is a little pretentious, textual practices. Okay, that's a broad term for lots of different things you might do with a document. So by that I mean, what do we know about the ancient authors and the editors and the collectors and the canonizers of the biblical tradition? The fact is that we don't know nearly as much as we would like to know. And in general, however, the impression that we get is that the production and the copying and the passing along and the editing and the translating of texts in the ancient world was complicated and fluid. I want to give you a sense of how complicated and how fluid it was, what a lengthy process it was, even before the Bible as we know it came to exist. The second component of the question, how do we get our Bible, has to do with textual practices in the medieval world, in the Reformation world, in the early modern period. It was in this time, sort of in between the time of the biblical story itself and our own English Bibles, that scholars preserved and even improved the biblical text for us, and in which they developed scholarly techniques that we might call textual criticism, that have totally changed the way that we encounter the Bible and the biblical text. So how we got our Bible means what were the ancient textual practices and what were the medieval and the Reformation scholarly practices around the text. But also third, the question has to do with the Bible itself as an object. Now, normally I would hold one up, but I don't have one. And I would ask you to look at them, but you don't have one. You know where mine is? It's right in here. That counts. That question in particular, what gave us our objects that we call the Bible today, will be the focus of future sessions. Today I want to focus on those first two parts, the ancient and the medieval, what we might call textual practices. Sound good? Everybody good? All right. So let me say at the start that we can't go through every piece of evidence in detail this morning. What I'm going to try to do is help you think about the evidence that we have and to learn how to think about the text of the Bible, perhaps in a new way, but hopefully in a more nuanced or a careful way with a little bit of insight. I'm thinking about also bringing one further element to our conversation, something that I would not necessarily address in a college class or in an academic lecture at a conference or something like that. It's the question of theology. Each lecture will conclude with a section of theological reflection on the issues that we have covered that week. And in the final session, I want to articulate a theology of Bible translation. And just to be honest, I'm still working on it. I'm not exactly sure I know what I'm going to say. But they say trust the process. Well, for one thing, the Bible, we know, is central to Christian theology. And so the interpretation of the Bible is a major part of all theological debate and discussion, right? We know that. And that takes place in all of the world's languages. So what that means is that we have to understand translation as part of the larger Christian theological witness. Second, we recognize that theology is a linguistic phenomenon. We use words to describe God, to describe our relationship with God. Words. And when we use English words that are the translation of Greek and Hebrew or Aramaic words, now we're in the world of translation. And I will also say that one important type of theology is ethical reflection. I believe that we need an ethics of Bible reading, an ethics of biblical interpretation, which I think means we also need an ethics of Bible translation. We'll talk about that even starting next week when we get into modern controversies and debates about Bible translation in especially social and political contexts. So, for today, then, let's begin by thinking for a moment about ancient textual practices and the process of the Bible's canonization, the very earliest stage of how we got our Bible. First, we need to distinguish throughout our conversation, you can sort of see that, throughout our conversation between the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. They have very different textual issues, very different history. The only thing that these two sections of the Bible have in common from a textual historical point of view is that we do not have any original manuscripts, or really anything close to, hundreds of years from an original manuscript. My specialty is Old Testament, and most scholars agree that literacy and writing in the ancient world, in ancient Israel, developed along the same time as the creation of the monarchy and of the nation state. Everybody here learned how to read in a particular context. And so you must have institutions that promote and support and develop literacy for particular purposes. And so we believe that writing then and literacy developed along with the monarchy in ancient Israel. This would be maybe 9th century BCE. The earliest written texts that we have are inscriptions, fragments of writing that have been discovered by archaeologists or on a variety of surfaces. Many inscriptions now have started to appear just on the market. Those are a different issue. The earliest inscriptions date... Are we too loud now? The earliest inscriptions date no earlier than the 9th or the 10th centuries BCE, about the same time that Israel was becoming a nation with a monarchy and with a national infrastructure. The monarchy employed scribes, scholars trained and employed to keep track of logistical records, as well as important documents, including histories, rituals, laws, wisdom teaching, prophecies, that sort of thing. Scribes, we know, played an important part in every ancient civilization, from ancient Sumer and Babylon to Egypt. This is an image of a carving of a scribe in the Egyptian context, and he's holding his little tablet with his little pen. Unfortunately, we do not have any physical copies of anything produced by these hypothetical Israelite scribes. The earliest textual evidence in Israel includes the Gezer calendar, which is this thing. The Gezer calendar, which is a list of activities scheduled in the agricultural year. Planting, sowing, reaping, like all the things that you do in an agricultural year. And we also have a thing called an abecedary, which is a fancy word for the ABCs. Evidence of people practicing their alphabetic script. This one has had the carving colored in by the artist who did the image, so you can see the letters a little better. They're not actually that dark. They're actually really difficult to read. These two texts that we just saw, the Gezer calendar and this abecedary, date to the 10th century BCE. They're the very earliest examples of writing in the context of ancient Israel. Later, as we move into the 8th, 7th, and 6th centuries BCE, archaeological excavations have unearthed other types of written material, most notably seals and bullae, basically ancient signature stamps. A seal is the little piece of rock or precious stone that you press into the clay to make your mark. And bullae means the clay impression that's left behind. And sometimes scholars find both. Sometimes they find one or the other. This is a very important seal find you may have read about in the last few years that includes the name of King Hezekiah of Judah. Scholars have also found ostraca, which are like essentially post-it notes containing administrative notes, tiny receipts. It's on pieces of pottery. The thing about pottery that's pretty interesting and helpful for scholars is that it's very fragile, so it breaks, but the pieces themselves are almost indestructible. So we have all of this broken pottery that's used for dating archaeological layers, but also those little bits become their administrative post-it notes where they send little receipts and chits back and forth to different cities. There are also monumental inscriptions, a very few. This one is called the Siloam inscription. This was carved into the wall of Hezekiah's tunnel, water tunnel that he built in preparation for being invaded by the Assyrians. And it was carved into the side of the wall at the point where the two teams that were digging the tunnel met. And it describes how one team was hammering and the other team was hammering. They could hear each other and they were calling to each other. And then finally they broke through and they celebrated, we've finished the tunnel. And then later on, the British found it and hacked it out of the wall and they took it back to their museum. It's currently, I think, in Turkey, actually. You may read about, in the news, sometimes they come up, few inscriptions that relate more to religion. This proves that or this proves that. Those have mostly turned out to be modern forgeries. One rare exception is the pair of silver amulets, tiny little silver scrolls that have been rolled up into little tiny cigar butt looking things. They were found in situ, which means they were dug up in the ground, which is amazing, by Gabriel Barkai in 1979 at a site called Ketef Hinnom outside of Jerusalem. It contains, on the left is the silver that's been hammered out, and then a drawing of the letters, and then on the right is the Hebrew legend that the scholars have provided. It contains the only example in the ancient period of a text that would later end up in the Bible. The priestly blessing in Numbers 6. It says in part, "May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you." So this was 500s BC, 6th century BC. And they were these tiny bits that were rolled up and they serve as little amulets that people would wear. It's like wearing a little, prayer thing on your person. So, as amazing as this is, if the only text that we have from the Bible between its period of composition and then much later manuscripts is a single prayer from Numbers, what does that mean? First, it means that we have to presume that there was a long, even centuries-long, history of oral transmission. Instead of imagining solitary figures like Moses or Solomon sitting at their desks writing out long compositions, we have to picture entire communities of people and their leaders sharing texts and traditions with each new generation. At some point in the process, these oral traditions are written down. But honestly, we don't know how early that was or where it took place or who did it. Take the book of Isaiah, for example. There was a prophet who lived in Jerusalem in the 8th century BCE whose name was Isaiah. He prophesied many things related to the destruction of Israel and the invasion of Judah by the Assyrians. This was 700s BCE. A significant part of Isaiah chapters 1 through 39 probably came from this prophet. I can't say he looked exactly like that, but seems close. Isaiah's prophecies in the 8th century were remembered. They were eventually written down and at some point taken to the exile, the Babylonian exile, with Israelite refugees 150 years after this prophet. In the exile, probably about 550 BCE, unknown prophets added new oracles to Isaiah's original collection that addressed their own situation. And these are found in Isaiah chapters 40 to 55. And then even later, back in Jerusalem, at the end of the 6th century, maybe right around 500, even more prophets, unknown, unnamed prophets, extended that collection even further, adding new prophecies about Judah during the post-exile, the so-called Persian period. So in light of this complex history of composition, of all of these prophecies from a 200-year period, which appear in the Bible as Isaiah, what is the book of Isaiah? Who are its authors, or who is its author? Isaiah is not simply one thing. It does not really have an author. Isaiah is more accurately a textual tradition that was alive and developing for 200 years. Eventually, it was frozen into something more or less finished. It was copied onto a single scroll. It became the book of Isaiah. Eventually, it became a book in the Bible. But the process of editing, addition, compilation, collection, reinterpretation, passing down, addition was incredibly long and complicated, even before canonization began. This is a picture of the Isaiah scroll from Qumran I'm going to get to in a second. So in general, this thing was working perfectly earlier. It's sort of odd. Strange. So in general, we have very little physical evidence related to ancient Israel's textual practices from the time of earliest Israel. Be nice if we had more, don't you think? However, as we move past the events that are described in the Old Testament into the later period of Greek and Roman occupation of Israel, particularly 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, we suddenly have a lot more to study. The most significant discovery took place in 1946, the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Judean wilderness to the southeast of Jerusalem. These scrolls were discovered by accidentally and then unearthed by archaeologists in 11 different caves. Here's a picture of one of the most famous caves. You can see the cave is here on this side of this giant hill. They've been associated with the nearby archaeological site at Qumran, just here, where Jewish sectarians lived for 2 centuries before being annihilated in the Jewish revolt against the Romans in 66 in the Common Era. The so-called Essenes at Qumran hid their precious manuscripts in caves, where they lay for 2 millennia before being discovered soon after World War II. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which you may have heard of, contain fragments of every Old Testament text except Esther, including relatively complete copies of some books, including the Isaiah scroll I showed you a second ago, in addition to many sectarian and other scriptural texts. Here is from the Shrine of the Book in Israel. This is in the center is a magnificent display of the 50-foot long Isaiah scroll. If you go there now, you actually don't see the real Isaiah scroll. You see a facsimile because it was getting too much light exposure.
Is there a particular reason why Esther was not included?
No, but that's one of my points is that I don't know why any of this stuff happened. That's a good question. It is interesting. Esther, the only book in the Old Testament that doesn't mention God. So, maybe. Well, it was not part of their scriptural collection. That's all that we can say. So, what do we learn from these textual practices at Qumran? First, we know that the scribes at Qumran were engaged in the kind of scribal activity that we would expect to find based on our hypothesis that I laid out a minute ago. They collected and copied and preserved texts that they held dear, that related to their religious and political and social identity. They had collections of texts. They did not have a Bible in the sense of having a book or indeed of having a single scriptural canon. They had lots of texts. Fragments found at Qumran witness to their vibrant and complicated textual practices. For instance, they had copies of Psalms. Here's one. But they did not have the Psalms in the sense of a set numbered collection like we have in the Psalms. In the 1st century of Qumran, at least, there was no such thing as a closed set collection called the Psalms. In fact, in addition to the biblical Psalms, they had another book that contained their own songs called the Hodayot, thanksgiving hymns related to their own history and to their own ritual practices. One of them says, you have supported me, this is it, you have supported me in steadfast faithfulness, and with your Holy Spirit you have delighted me. That sounds like the Psalms, doesn't it? So even though we might think about the Psalms at Qumran to be the Bible and their Hodayot or their thanksgiving hymns to be, quote, sectarian literature, we can't be at all sure that the Essenes at Qumran made that distinction. They had hymns. Some of those hymns ended up in the Psalms in our Bible and some of them didn't. We make that distinction because we are influenced by how things turned out, by the canon, which was yet in the future at the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, textual practices. Now, these things show up in the news. You might hear someone claim that the Dead Sea Scrolls prove this or that with respect to the Bible's history or reliability. And indeed, they do give a lot of information to scholars. They've totally changed how we study the Old Testament's textual history. However, don't forget that the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves are hundreds of years after the events, the biblical events that they are supposed to describe, and even hundreds of years after the writing of the manuscripts that describe those events. The fact is, for any particular tradition, from Abraham to the exile and beyond, there was a long and complicated textual process even before the Dead Sea Scrolls came around. And the scrolls themselves predate the creation of anything that we might identify as the Bible. So when we talk about ancient textual practices, in a precise sense, we're not even talking about the Bible. We're discussing traditional ingredients that later became the Bible. The Bible itself is a construction, something that people put together in the context of conflict and disagreement in a later period. It does not help us to imagine that process as smooth or simple or inevitable. So, how does this relate to translation? The history of the Old Testament was long and complicated, right? And one aspect of this long and complicated history was translation, the transformation of texts from one form into a new form, from one language into a new language. Several ancient translations witness to this complicated textual history that we've been discussing. I don't have time to survey these in detail, and you probably don't want me to. But I want to mention the two most important ancient translations, the Targum and the Septuagint, both of which became necessary because the Jewish community, starting in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, were no longer using Hebrew as their main language. The Targums, first of all, are paraphrases of biblical texts into Aramaic. They were not seen as authoritative translations. They were not the text in competition with the Hebrew original. They weren't considered to be the same thing. But they were explanations and commentaries intended to make the original text more understandable, more accessible to the Jewish audience, who were more comfortable with Aramaic than Hebrew. These different collections of Targums are a fascinating set of texts that scholars study for a lot of reasons. One is because we can look at their translation philosophy. That's kind of interesting. We can look at their evidence of Jewish ancient interpretation, which is interesting. They're just also really interesting, just by themselves. Bruce Metzger, lead translator of the New Revised Standard Version, you may have heard his name, has argued that the Targums serve 6 purposes. To resolve textual difficulties, or listen to these, I'm going to argue that these are the purposes of translation. To resolve textual difficulties, to harmonize conflicting texts, to reconcile biblical text with tradition, to incorporate their Jewish interpretations into the text, to explain historical or religious allusions, and to either strengthen or mitigate the force of a passage. One thing that the Targums do very well is fill in gaps and ambiguities in the original text. So, the way that a sermon might explain to you the meaning of things by filling in where it's confusing or missing information. For example, in the story of Cain's murder of Abel, the text says that Abel's offering of meat was pleasing to God while Cain's of vegetables was not pleasing. Have you ever wondered what exactly the problem with Cain's offering was? Like, why did this happen? I think that Cain also wondered about it. In the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, we find a discussion between Cain and Abel about the nature of divine justice. Cain is very angry that his offering was rejected and says, in fact, now this proves that there is no divine judge, there is no divine justice, there are no consequences for anybody's actions. And Abel says, oh no, you're wrong, there is a judge, there are consequences. And their quarrel leads to Cain killing his brother. And so Cain's killing of Abel is in some ways out of the blue in the text. And so here we have a paraphrase that includes this new scene in which we see the relationship between the brothers as very tense, and they're having this theological argument. And, the first theological argument to lead to one person killing another. The Targum then serves a purpose of making the outline of the story accessible to the people while also explaining it, closing gaps, resolving ambiguities in the text, which I think is ultimately the task of all translations that seek to be readable or accessible or modern. We're going to see this in weeks to come. These translations make the text available to you, explains the text to you, explains cultural references that you might not understand, and also, by the way, heightens particular passages and mutes other ones. So that's the Targum. There's a picture of it. 2 pictures. The second major translation project in the ancient world was also decisive for early Christians. In the 2nd century BCE in Alexandria in Egypt, the prosperous and worldly Jewish community wanted a Bible in their own language, Greek. And that showed the Greek world that Jewish religion is philosophically respectable. This was the program of all of the Alexandrian Jews in that time period. And so over a period of time, a large number of translators eventually created the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that we know as the Septuagint, often abbreviated LX6. So it's a Greek Bible, Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. The Septuagint is incredibly important to scholars because it gives us a window not only into Jewish interpretation, but it also gives us a window into the state of the Hebrew text at the time that it was done. Consider, for example, that the book of Jeremiah in the Septuagint is about an eighth shorter than the book of Jeremiah that has survived in our Hebrew Bible. And there's a different order. So clearly, whatever Hebrew text was used by the Septuagint translators, it was substantially different from the one that later became part of the Hebrew Bible, what scholars call the Masoretic text, after the scribes who preserved it in the Middle Ages, the Masoretes. There's a picture of the Septuagint, original, not original, but old. There's another one. The Masoretic text is the Hebrew text that is the basis of all modern Hebrew Bible academic study and translation. And it's based on two very important medieval manuscripts. One is called the Aleppo Codex. This is a picture of it, which dates to 920 CE. And one called the Leningrad Codex, which is this is a beautiful cover for it, which dated to 1009 CE, Common Era. So I think I have a picture of the Leningrad Codex. Was one of these Hebrew texts of Jeremiah older than the other one? With the later one being a revision of the earlier one? These are the questions we want to ask. So if one Hebrew text was shorter in a different order, which of them was, quote, the original? Or maybe there were two independent traditions that diverged. Finally, one of them dying out, and then the other one becoming the Hebrew text that we know. These are the questions, praise be to the Lord, that keep biblical scholars in business. It's also significant to note here, and I think you might find this to be interesting, that there arose a mythic story about the supernatural origins of the Septuagint. It's in a 2nd century CE text called the Letter of Aristeas. In that letter, it is claimed that 72 scholars went into 72 solitary caves and translated the whole Bible into Greek and emerged with 72 identical copies. Now, it's easy enough from the variety of the Greek text itself to disprove this story, but as we go forward, you will see that people are all too eager to make fantastical claims about the inspired and perfect nature of their favorite translation. This includes modern Christians who, frankly, should know better. Included with the Greek Septuagint translation of the Hebrew Scriptures were other texts in Greek that are otherwise similar to Hebrew texts in nature and substance. So, it translated the Hebrew text into Greek, and then there's other Greek texts included within it. In the Hebrew Scriptures, there are history texts. In the later Greek Scriptures, there are history texts. In the Hebrew Scriptures, there are Psalms and wisdom texts. And in the later Greek Scriptures, there are Psalms and wisdom texts. In the Hebrew Scriptures, there are prophetic texts. And in the later Greek Scriptures, there are prophetic texts, specifically of an apocalyptic nature. These Greek scriptural texts were later on not included in the Hebrew Bible, not being Hebrew. But they were widely used by Jews and by early Christians, quoted in the New Testament. Some of them did find their way into the Christian Old Testament via the Vulgate, the Latin translation I'll talk about in a minute. Protestants later on separated these texts from their Hebrew originals, and these are the things that we have come to call the Apocrypha, or the deuterocanonical books. And if you have, from your old days at Furman or whatever, an old Oxford Study Bible left over from college, you probably have the Apocrypha in there. You can also find some of the Apocrypha in the Catholic Bible. Why is that? Well, because, as I said, early Christians read from the Greek Scriptures. And when St. Jerome translated the Bible from Greek into Latin in the early 5th century, he included Greek texts. 1,000 years later, Protestants put those extra texts into their own section. saying that they are authoritative but not at the same level as the Old and the New Testaments. And like all optional readings I have learned in my 18 years of teaching, people do not read things that aren't required. And so Protestants eventually stopped reading the Apocrypha altogether. There is a translation of the Apocrypha in the King James Bible. You can buy old copies of the King James Bible with the Apocrypha in it. Good luck finding one of those at Crossway. That's how a book like 1 Maccabees is in the Catholic Bible, but not in the Protestant Bible. So, what do we take away from all of this? Admittedly arcane, but I think very fascinating history. 3 things. First, the process of composition of the Bible is long and complicated. It involves many stages of composition along the way, including oral tradition, scribal recording, editing, rewriting, addition, expansion, and after many steps, canonization. Even the canon itself was a fluid concept that got worked out over time in the community. In fact, the canon, as we've seen with Protestant and Catholic Bibles, even today, means different things to different people. In fact, if somebody says the Bible, your next question should always be, which Bible? And third, and this is clear and inescapable, the meaning of the term the Bible is not only complicated, it is also a contested term, an ideological term. People give the term Bible to their Bible, and then they use their Bible to back up whatever religious or political argument they're trying to make. In the modern context, the definition of Bible often includes a particular English translation or even a particular study Bible that's being used or not used. So, there's the Old Testament in a nutshell. The New Testament, you think, oh, this is going to be easier. No. The story of the New Testament takes us very quickly out of the ancient world into the medieval and the modern worlds. Let's start with Jesus and his disciples. They did not write anything down. Jesus did write that one thing in the dirt. That's all we know. In the decades after the life of Jesus, stories about him in collections circulated orally among the first generations of his followers. 2 decades after Jesus, we hear Paul writing to his churches, often with snippets of oral tradition about Jesus. For example, 1 Corinthians 11, the passage about the Last Supper. This is evidently an oral story about Jesus that Paul has heard and he's incorporating into his letter. And within 3 decades after Paul, so into the 80s, multiple authors had pulled together these oral and written traditions about Jesus to create the Gospels. And by the end of the first century in the Common Era, the New Testament texts had all been written. But we don't have any of those manuscripts either. In fact, from the first 300 years of Christian history, we have fragments of tradition and quotations from ancient church fathers, and that's it. Among the most important fragments of the New Testament in this early period are there are 3 papyri from the 3rd century, the Chester Beatty manuscripts. This is one of them. They're called P45, 46, and 47. They include passages from the Gospels, from Paul's letters, and from Revelation. The P52 fragment is the oldest fragment of the New Testament, a tiny bit of the Gospel of John that dates to about 125 CE. This is the oldest thing we have. And you see it's just a few words. After the New Testament canon was set in the 4th century, church leaders worked to standardize the text of the New Testament. Jerome, previously mentioned, in creating his Latin Vulgate translation in the early 5th century, used a version of the New Testament along with the Greek text of the Old Testament. And that Greek text continued to be copied and preserved in the Eastern Orthodox Church. They continued using the Greek even after the split from East and West. And that became known as the Byzantine textual tradition. The Byzantine textual family has by far the most manuscripts of the New Testament, dating back into the 6th or possibly 5th century CE. So, in the ancient period, it took hundreds of years for these texts to be set and canonized, and it's only after it's canonized that we find anything approaching complete copies. Before that, all we have are tiny fragments. In the 16th century, a new generation of textual scholars began studying these available manuscripts and working on updated versions of the New Testament. The most important work was done by a scholar named Erasmus, who published a new version of the Greek text in 1516. His Greek text, along with another by Theodore Beza, became the basis of Reformation translation of the Bible. These New Testament texts became known as, and you may have heard this word before, Textus Receptus, which means received text. This is the New Testament text as it was passed down through the Eastern Church and eventually used by Protestants in their translation work in the Reformation. Catholics, they were using the Vulgate. They were using the Latin. They had no interest in the Greek, at least originally. So, these texts are known in the field as eclectic texts. Eclectic means mixture, right? It's a mix of things. The New Testament is an eclectic text, which means that if you have a New Testament, I meant to bring mine. If you have a copy of the New Testament, it is not a copy of a manuscript. It is made up of thousands of different manuscripts and fragments reconstructed by the scholars, the editors who created that New Testament. This is why there are 28 versions of the Nestle Aland, which is the one that if you go to seminary, that's what you have to buy. There's 28 editions of that going back into the 19th century. So the New Testament used by scholars and therefore by translators is a composite of different manuscripts, not a copy of one manuscript. Whereas the Hebrew text is based on the Leningrad Codex. It's basically one text with some additions around the corners. The New Testament is a mixture. I'm limited by how much I can get into this, but in the 2 centuries after the Reformation, there developed in English and German universities a new field of critical academic biblical studies that was separate from religious authority. I have a senior seminar that I teach for religion majors that's called Modern Academic Biblical Studies, and it basically answers the question, who am I? And this is when it begins. Scholars, starting in the 17th, 18th, into the 19th and 20th centuries, began to study the Old and New Testament texts, as human artifacts, not only as eternal sources of theological truth. Jonathan Sheehan, a historian, has called this work the development of the Enlightenment Bible, the modern Bible as a cultural object, as a cultural process, not functioning as only the eternal Word of God in preaching and theology. Now that paragraph was fairly complicated, so it's okay if I went over that too fast. I'm going to talk more about that in weeks to come. In any case, when these scholars started to compare the many Greek New Testaments at their disposal, they were shocked at how many differences there were. These became known as variants, places where the same verse in different manuscripts has slightly or significantly different Greek wording. English scholar Richard Bentley, in 1716, began to wrestle with the tens of thousands of variants in the New Testament. He argued ultimately that even though their variants are very numerous, they did nothing to question the basic reliability of the New Testament. He says readers should focus on the true text, not the printed text, when they thought about the New Testament. That's a pretty amazing argument. Picking up on his work a generation later, German scholar Johann Albrecht Bingel, attempted to put the New Testament manuscripts into rational order. So instead of just cataloging variants, cataloging differences, which earlier scholars had done, Bingel said, can we make decisions? Can we decide which of these is original, which of these is better than the other ones? He went further than just cataloging differences and wanted to evaluate those differences, wanted to make judgments about which ones were most likely original. Bingel gave us the foundational textual critical principle, which is this. It's become known in Latin as the difficilio lectio portior. That's the Latin. It means that the more difficult reading is to be preferred. The more difficult reading. Now that sounds like scholars, doesn't it? There's a subtle brilliance to this. Think about it. Before Bingel, scholars had preferred the clearer reading. But Bingel reasoned that if a scribe is making a change, he's much more likely to change something hard into something easy than to change something easy into something hard. So all things considered, the harder reading is more likely to be the original reading. Yeah, it's good, right? Bingel's second great contribution was to divide New Testament manuscripts into different families based on shared characteristics. There's Bingel's book. He reasoned that a parent manuscript could lead to more than one child manuscript. And there may be many existing copies of a particular branch of the tree, but the number of manuscripts does not matter as much as that branch is closest to the original. So the A up here on the top is the original, but it's in brackets, meaning it doesn't exist. But we do have the capital A, and we have B and C that are different. So what this means is there must have been some original variant that gave rise to these two, which are similar in some ways but different in some ways. And so the scholar is trying to look at A, B, and C and D and E and figure out what was the process from the original that branched out into all of these various copies. And let's say we've got 1,000 copies of E, but only one copy of A. Which one of those is better? It's the A, even though we've only got one of them. Right? Okay. So, why is this important? He was responsible, Bingel, in large part for an important shift in the way biblical scholars understand the Bible. Instead of seeing the Bible as an idealized, disembodied carrier of theological truth, they came to see biblical texts as texts, maybe as we should say, manuscripts, as pieces of evidence for reconstructing history. As Sheehan says, biblical texts became, for the first time, documents. In the centuries after Bingel and Bentley, scholars continued to study these things. In the 19th century, they became aware of and began to use two new manuscripts. One of them is the Codex Vaticanus, which had been in the Vatican but was only available in transcription in the 19th century. And one was the Codex Sinaiticus, which is here, which was found in the St. Catherine Monastery in Sinai in the 19th century, in the trash can, they said. The study of these texts, which are from an Alexandrian family, would revolutionize the New Testament study, and also in the 19th into the 20th centuries created a revolution in Bible translation. This is a radically new family of New Testament manuscripts that were complete 4th century texts that were much better than the ones that had been used in the Textus Receptus in the centuries beforehand. Now, the discovery and use of these new manuscript families in the 19th and 20th centuries created a conflict that we will begin to look at next week. So, in conclusion, what are the theological conclusions that we draw from all of this? First, I will say this. Our attention to the practical, material aspects of the Bible reminds us that translation is not a disembodied, ghostly phenomenon. It does not exist out there in the ether. Translation is a textual practice. It's embedded in culture. It's performed by people sitting at desks. Scholars use sources that came to them from somewhere. This is what all of these people we've studied have in common. Ancient scribes and editors and translators, modern scribes and editors and translators, they are all being paid to do a job for somebody. They are serving an audience, a community who needs their work. Translation work is a human activity done by people for people in particular times and places. And so this means theologically that translation is human and participates in everything human, including limitations, ignorance, error. We cannot make claims to perfection or holiness for any translation or indeed any manuscript that is used in the translation process. So for the church, then, translation is part of this process of bringing the Word of God to new generations. How can we do that? As a church, I think we must think of the biblical text as incarnational. Like Jesus, who was fully human and fully divine, can we recognize the divine truth and the fully human form of the Bible? As with Jesus, there is the constant threat of Gnosticism, that ancient heresy in which it was said that Jesus was divine but not human. Christians, as I got 3 sentences, this is the end. Christians who claim divinity but not humanity for the Bible are in danger of making claims that we should not even make for Christ himself. Indeed, they are in danger of replacing Christ himself with the Bible. If there's anything that a careful and critical study of Bible translation will help us with, it's tendencies we may have toward bibliolatry, turning the Bible itself into an idol. So we'll be coming into contact with that tendency next week. Thank you so much. I think I have a couple of minutes for questions. Yes, not a whole lot. I'm sorry, I went over a little bit.
What would cause people to walk away from their primary language, i.e. Hebrew, to a secondary language, Aramaic?
It's the same reason that English is used all over the world. So it becomes, Aramaic becomes the lingua franca. It becomes the language that everybody uses for business, and it just becomes the language that people use and learn. And so Hebrew becomes a language only used by priests and scribes in closed sections. So that's why it's just, you see Jesus talking Aramaic, for example, right? In the New Testament shows that Jesus' followers, there's a lot of debate about whether Jesus read Hebrew or not, but that's just, has to do with social, cultural changes. Good question. Yes?
How limited was literacy in the ancient times?
I think it was very limited. And scholars disagree about this, but I think it was very limited. I think it was limited to official contexts. I don't think any normal person, just worker, farmer, whatever, would have any kind of literacy. These are things that are done for particular official purposes. I think later on in the Persian period, when you have the stability of the Persian Empire, I do believe those numbers start going up. Questions? Okay, so next week we're going to be talking about the controversies over the translation of the Bible in the 20th century, especially the Revised Standard Version in the 1950s, which touched off a huge just crisis. And so that's going to be the topic for next week. Thank you so much.